Hey, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining tonight's live stream where we will be discussing apparel with impact, education, advocacy, and ending cycles, negative cycles. So I am really excited to have one of our partners on the show today. Sharon Dunlevy is the CEO and the owner of Foster Care Training Today. So I'm really excited to get into her work and the coaching that she provides for foster care. As I mentioned, she is a Cherry Willow Apparel partner. And so if you would like to learn a little bit more about our partnership process, how you can use apparel to help get your message out in the community and also raise additional funds to make more of an impact, please reach out to myself or Shauna, my director of impact, and we'd love to share with you a little bit more about the model. We have some exciting updates from Cherry Willow coming from my recent Pedal for Progress ride. So the documentary should be coming out within the next month or so. So we'll be promoting each of the partners that we met with in California, promoting their initiatives across our social media, and just really trying to provide and highlight some of the great work that's being done to address homelessness in California and across the country. And then I'm really excited to, bring on our partner today, Sharon, and talk a little bit specifically about, her work in the foster care space. And that's one of the topics that we'll be diving into is kind of some of the intersections between foster care and homelessness. But Sharon, thank you so much for coming on the show. And I'd love for you to be able to introduce yourself to our audience.
Thanks, Matt. I'm really excited to be here too. As you said, I am an educational advocate for children in foster care. And right now, my primary mission is to reach as many foster parents as I can, training them to be educational advocates for the kids in their care. And I know we'll go further in depth in what that means and how that looks. But basically, most states do not have educational advocates for children in foster care, so it's really important for foster parents to know what laws protect their kids when they're in school and how to leverage those laws so that the kids can get the best education possible, so that when they graduate, they don't become part of that homelessness number. And that is the biggest issue that I try and address. So it's just really great to be here, and I'm really looking forward to this topic.
Yeah, really, really excited to have you on. And I love being able to do these live streams, to be able to, provide a great platform for some of the partners that we have and just to talk about the really impactful work that you're doing in your community. So we have a few different topics that we're going to get into today. And, the first one really starts with the role of education, in changing outcomes. Now, certainly, I see this in our work with homeless advocacy, whether it's educating the people experiencing homelessness so that they can empower themselves to take advantage of other opportunities to generate more income for themselves, or oftentimes educating people in the community about the realities that these people are facing and how they can actually support them rather than, otherize or try to, blame these individuals for being in that circumstance. But I'm really excited to learn a little bit more about specifically the role of education in foster care and how you coach, parents around some of these things. So I'd love for you to elaborate on that for us.
Sure. So one of the things that you said, Matt, really struck me is that blaming the ones who are experiencing homelessness. We do that a lot in our society. We blame the victims, right? And the same thing happens with our kids in foster care. So what happens is, and schools don't mean to do this, and I'm going to say right up front, I'm not denigrating schools. They have a lot to go through, right? The teachers' rooms are overcrowded. They don't have the aides that they used to have. They don't have the help. Most of our kids have IEPs or individualized education plans. So it does get to be a lot. But the needs of kids in foster care are so much greater than other kids because of trauma. Just being removed from their home is a trauma in itself, let alone whatever reason they were removed from their home. And so a lot of times what happens for kids when they're in foster care and going to school is their trauma is so deep that they are in what we call the survival brain. It's back here in the back of our skull, and basically that is where our instinct takes over, and we will be in that fight, flight, or freeze mode. Well, kids who have trauma don't know how to come out of that mode. They stay in that survival mode. So then when they go into school, they're just trying to survive. So their brain is not necessarily focusing on the tasks at hand. And they have behaviors that get to be difficult. And so what I try and do is I try and work with the foster parents, one, on how do we help these kids manage their behaviors and still do well in school. And there's a few laws that we can use to help them. One is the Every Student Succeeds Act, which allows foster kids to stay in one school rather than move from school to school if they change homes, even if that school is out of district. And that has made a huge difference for kids because I have talked to kids who have been in 9 different high schools, not 9 different schools, 9 different high schools. Imagine trying to learn as you're constantly moving and every move is causing trauma. And then we also have kids who, when they do move and they have to change schools, they weren't getting enrolled automatically because we didn't have their medical records or their social security cards. And ESSA has said that that is no longer an impediment. So schools must enroll these kids immediately. And why this is important is because the longer and the more a kid can be in the classroom learning, even if they're having some trauma issues and stuff like that, if they can be in the classroom learning, they're less likely to drop out. And if they drop out, they're more likely to be homeless, right? So it's a cycle. And so we're trying to teach these parents the ways to break those cycles. So you have that law. But then the other law that we have is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And if we can work with our kids and help them get an individualized education plan where their trauma behaviors are not causing them to be sent to the principal's office, but instead are having accommodations within the classroom, then they're able to stay in there and learn even more. And so all of this just works together to try and break that cycle of what happens to kids and why they become in foster care. Right? Because we know, I mean, Matt, you know, with homelessness, somebody homeless children are likely to be homeless as adults because they don't know anything else. And so we want to break that cycle, and education is the way to do it. But we have to work with these foster kids because they're not traditional learners. And that's where I come in and where the foster parents come in.
Yeah, and I think that again, that kind of goes to our work in the homelessness space or anyone in that sector, where it's about meeting people where they're at. And certainly, when you mention trauma, that's something that I think everyone can relate to. Whatever experiences you've gone through in your life, there's probably been some level of trauma, some level of loss, something that you can relate to, and think about how you felt when you were in that situation. And that's always whenever I'm talking to people about homelessness, like the insecurity that you're talking about, the moving around. That's
Mhm,
exactly what people experiencing homelessness are going through day in and day out, not having a roof over their head, not knowing where their next meal may be coming from,
mhm,
living in a crowded shelter environment, so that sense of community that maybe can be lost, which, as a single dad
mhm,
with 3 kids, I can't imagine if my kids were having to shuttle between 2 3 different schools in a school year. Just how challenging that is. And even when the kids tell me that there's new kids in the class, I would say, oh, did you go
mhm.
introduce yourself?
Yeah.
Did you make them feel welcome? Because it's like, how would you feel if you were in that situation? And so I can't imagine as a foster kid having to go through that. So when you are working with parents, if we have anyone in the audience that knows a foster parent or wants to support, what are some of the guidance that you typically provide, or like maybe things that people can try to make themselves more aware of to make those situations a little bit easier for some of the kids in foster care?
Yeah, sure. So, one of the things that is really important and sometimes can be really hard is creating a positive relationship with that school up front. So, again, a lot of the times the schools don't understand what it means for a kid to be in foster care. And honestly, our society doesn't understand. We don't talk about foster kids. We know they exist. And we might hear about them in the media if a crime is committed and they'll say, kind of offhanded, oh, and he was a foster kid, right? Like that's when we hear about foster kids. We don't hear about the day to day. We don't really hear that. And so I'm sure, and we could take up the whole time talking about what with the audience, what you think of when you hear of a kid being in foster care. You probably think of parents who are drug addicted. You probably think of parents who are abusive. You probably think of parents who maybe are homeless. Um, but um, there's so many reasons why a kid might be in foster care. And so every kid in foster care is going to react differently. And so it's really important for the foster parents to create a relationship with the schools so that when a kid does enter their home and they can go to the school and say, I have such and such a student, this is kind of the background. Things that I tell them to talk about is, what does the kid want you to be called? You as foster parents, what do they want you to be called? Because a lot of kids don't want to be known as foster kids.
Mm.
So how do they address you? And that's really important because we still have a lot of things in our schools that focus around a traditional family. Even for me, I live in Indianapolis, but my parents live all the way in Pennsylvania, and my husband's parents lived in Dayton, Ohio. Not that far away, but far enough away that if we had Grandparents' Day, we didn't have any grandparents near us. We were lucky. We had a couple in our church that adopted our kid and would do Grandparents' Day with them. But imagine a foster kid who doesn't have any of those relationships. So, how do they address that foster parent and how do they want to be addressed? Um, what are their triggers that they know? It's helpful for a teacher to know ahead of time that if a kid, if he's hungry, he's going to be irritated. It's also helpful for them to have that conversation about how can they keep in touch with each other, because let's say Johnny's had some really good days, but then he had a really bad visit with his mom. And so the next day in school, he acts out. Well, if foster mom can let the teacher know ahead of time, hey, this was a really bad visit. Johnny may be having some problems today. Just kind of keep your eye out. Text me if you need me, that type of thing. It builds a team model around the kid rather than like an us versus them. And I think that is really important, is to come into the schools not saying this is what I'm going to do for my kid and you better do it with me, but this is what my kid needs and I really want to work with you to make sure that my kid is getting the best education possible, but meanwhile supporting you as well, knowing that my kid can have some behavior issues that are difficult to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, and that really strikes a chord with just kind of the team model and surrounding people with
Hmm.
support. That's a huge part of success. I feel like just in any facet, if you're trying to come over something difficult. But to your point earlier about understanding the trauma and people's responses to that trauma, the
Hmm.
emotions that they're dealing with, if you can have that communication, and it just gives that little bit more grace where maybe you have a little bit more of an empathetic lens, an empathetic approach when you're dealing with these individuals versus, because that person could be struggling too, with something that's going on. And
Hmm.
especially in the homelessness space, and I'm sure in schools, like there is a lot of heavy emotional work that they're dealing with, and oftentimes are, trying to do the best, potentially under resourced, and being stretched thin, especially with all the budget cuts that are going on right now nationwide, affecting schools and homeless service organizations. So I love that kind of
Hmm.
teamwork approach and how you play a part in fostering that. And I think we also talked a little bit about kind of going into our second topic, like the intersection of the foster care and homelessness. So we've talked a little bit about the relationships between like how people can be really successful and create that team environment. But I'd love for you to share any of your experience about, the people that aren't able to do that, and, kind of how that can end up resulting in those kids transitioning from foster care into homelessness.
Sure. And I want to address something that Andrew said in the chat too,
Yeah.
because he talked about when we talk about why are kids removed from their home, and I mentioned drug addiction, and he said that his brain automatically goes to why did people fall into drug addiction? And that's a really good question, right? I mean, again, what happened in that person's background that caused them to fall into drug addiction? And sometimes it's a trauma response. And so, we have to be empathetic all the way around. And so, one of the things that, going back to your question, Matt, one of the things that I think about when I think about education and kids and avoiding that path of homelessness is transitioning out of foster care. That is an area that I really focus on. And in fact, I start teaching my foster parents how to teach independent living skills to kids in their home, regardless of their age. Even little ones can learn some independent living skills just by cleaning up their toys. What happens is we forget that foster kids are going to grow up. So we think about them when they're in these homes and, oh, they're such, how horrible it is. They've had a horrible life. But then we don't think about what happens when they grow up and they're on their own. My 23-year-old lives in our basement because right now in Indianapolis, the housing costs are ridiculous, and it's not worth it for them to pay into an apartment when it won't build their credit and stuff, So we're trying to build these life skills, but it's not the right environment. But they have us to fall back on. What about a foster kid who doesn't have that? So if they're not getting the education they need in order to get a job or go to college, then they are going to be at a disadvantage. And that's when that snowball effect happens. The other thing we know is from brain research, and there's been a lot of new brain research out there, but we know that the decision-making center of our brain, what we call up here, I talked about the survival mode back here. Well, the decision-making part of the brain is up here. This does not fully develop into our late 20s. And that is really old. So when you think about what we have our kids do, they drive at the age of 16. They can go to war at the age of 18. They can drink at the age of 21, and yet their brains are not fully developed until they're between 25 and 27. They're making a lot of adult decisions at a very young age when their brains are not fully developed. Well, then you add on top of that trauma, which regresses the brain and causes a kid who may be 18 to act like they're 13. And now we're asking them to age out of foster care. And then what?
Right.
There are programs in place, but they're underutilized because the states themselves are not really working well with them. But there's money for kids to stay in foster care all the way up to the age of 21 to 23. And there is money set aside for training vouchers all the way up to the age of 26. But that money is so underutilized because the states don't have programs in place to make use of those funds. And so if we did a better job early on training the foster parents, which is what I do, I let them know that the money that I'm talking about comes from the Family First Prevention Services Act. Now, we talked about the policy changes. Half of that money is under TANF, which is under fire right now.
Mm.
There is money available under the Chaffee funds, which are not under fire. But if TANF and SNAP are cut, we're going to be in a big, there's going to be some issues, right? About
Yeah.
how are we going to take care of our foster kids aging out when there's no money set aside. But we need to be working in that direction. We need to be thinking always, and I talk with my foster parents about this all the time. Remember that yes, you may have them now at 4 years old, but someday they're going to be 18, 19, 20, and they're going to be on their own, and making sure that they're ready for that. And the more we can do that, then the less likely they are to fall into homelessness. The reality is, if the money is there and it stays there, foster kids can use that money to help them pay for rent and food and board. I have a student that I worked with who he had some major difficulties. I mean, he was in residential for years because he had some major difficulties with his anger and stuff like that. He came out in high school, went through high school, we got him graduated, and he stayed in what we call our collaborative care program here in Indiana until the age of 23. They helped him pay for a apartment. They helped him find a roommate. They helped him get his driver's license. They helped him. They bought a motorbike for him so he could go back and forth to work. And he's doing really well. I'm still in touch with him, and he keeps me up to date, but he's had managerial positions and jobs, and he's been doing really well. But that was because he knew about the programs and took advantage of them. And that's really important, because if we don't even know about them, then how do you know to use them? And so I really, really try and focus a lot on that transition services and how we can bring that to awareness so that when kids are getting close to aging out, they know there's an option for them to still get some help before they have to do it all on their own.
Yeah, I mean that awareness piece is crucial, and I see that a lot in the homelessness space as well. I was actually just in a meeting earlier today with the chief of police in Yorkville, which is a town near me. There's a
Mhm,
protest. They just passed an ordinance, banning and fining people for sleeping in tents or sleeping even in cars on the street.
mhm,
And so there was advocates out there that were protesting, and the big takeaway for me from that meeting was there was a lot of resources that they use, but
mhm,
that I work in homelessness. I'm in, the same county. I didn't know were available. And I'm
mhm.
looking for these resources from the comfort of my own home,
Yeah,
not going through any of these traumatic circumstances. And
yeah,
I feel like that's something that most people don't think about. Like, oh, just get connected with resources. Number one, if you don't know that there is a resource to get connected with, how do you know what to
mhm,
look for? And it's just like
mhm.
I need help. I know I need help, but where do I go? Who do I see? So that's amazing that that's the kind of work that you're providing for those foster parents. But then when I'm in the shelters, that is one of the main groups of people that you'll see in there is young people that have aged
Mhm.
out of foster or youth homes. And then there's also a rising population now of seniors that
Yes.
are not able to pay rent, because
Mhm.
they're not getting enough funds from whether it's Social Security or what that income is just not enough to keep up with the cost of housing anymore. And so I think that's really when it comes to homelessness, like the creation of more affordable housing, helping young people get set up for success so that they can empower themselves and really
Mhm.
be, confident moving forward. So I love that that is, a large part of the work that you do.
Yeah, and Shauna made a good system or a good comment on, the huge percent of youth leave the system and want nothing to do with the system because of the lack of support. So, how many times, Matt, have you gone into those shelters and they're like, "Well, I'm not going to go get help because I've tried and they've turned me away, or they've made it this, I have to fill out 10 sheets of paper, and maybe they're illiterate, but they don't want to
Right.
admit it. I mean, we have put so many administrative roadblocks in the way for kids as well as for adults who are homeless, and it's getting worse,
Yeah.
unfortunately. It is getting worse. If Medicaid gets cut the way they want, I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, we're going to see more seniors in homeless shelters, and that should
Yeah.
not be. It's all about empathy and compassion, and I think we go back to that what we talked about where we blame the victims,
Right.
but they didn't choose to be there. There are a few people, yes, who take advantage of the system. That's always going to be the case. But do we really end a system just because of a few people, or
Yeah.
do we help the ones? And what's really tragic for all of this is we are a reactive society. We respond at the end. So these kids who are in foster care, if we did a better job of identifying these kids and these families before things got out of hand, maybe we could have kept them together.
Right.
Maybe they could have stayed in one home. Maybe they wouldn't have to move schools over and over again. What if we could have addressed all of this at the beginning? Same thing with the ones in the homeless shelter. How many times was it somebody who just had one disaster happen? Somebody mentioned that in the chat earlier, that, we're all just one step away from being homeless if
Yeah.
something bad happens and we don't have anybody to fall back on. And so, how are we preventing this as a society? And we're not. So many people stand back in judgment. And I know none of you guys in this group are, but because that's why you tune in, right? You're the
Right.
ones we want to talk to. But the ones who really need to hear this are probably not even listening, unfortunately. But we tend to stand back in judgment. We tend to blame the victims rather than saying, what did we do wrong to cause this to happen? And so I just, I get passionate about it, obviously,
Yeah. Yeah.
but it breaks my heart when I think about these kids that I work with who have incredible abilities, but are not able to use them or not seen as real people, right? They're a number.
Yeah.
I haven't thrown the number out there yet, but Matt alluded to the fact that there are a lot of young people in homeless shelters. 25% of kids aging out of foster care right now end up homeless. 20% end up incarcerated at some point in their life.
Wow.
And whose fault is that? Is that really the kids' fault? I doubt it, right? We as a society failed them by not having things in place to help them. And foster care is not going to end, and there's all sorts of things we could talk about how we could make things better at the beginning, but right now we're in a system that is very reactive. So all I can do is do my part of training those foster parents early so that no matter who's placed in their home, they're ready for whatever. Should it be a kid with high trauma, a kid who needs help in school, a kid who is getting ready to transition out and has had a horrible experience and doesn't want to stay in the system, but needs that extra help? All of those types of kids. We really, really need to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And I think that really uh, brings up our next topic and transitions beautifully into the importance of community building. And, I can think of, I like to study history. And so I'll read a lot of different texts and books about different points in history. And there was a time where, if someone was going to get their house taken away by the bank, the whole community would show up for them. And they would like, no, we're not allowing this family to be displaced. And now, like, technology is great. And I bring this up on a lot of my live streams, or if you see me talk, it allows us to connect like this when you're in Indianapolis and I'm in Chicago. But technology has also isolated us in a lot of ways. It's taken us away from the community in our area, the physical community. And, that's why at Cherry Willow, we use apparel to create those in-person conversations, to spark that connection, and really just to get people back around looking out for each other in the community, showing up for each other in the community. Like when you think of kids, everyone shows up for the sporting events or for the play or for the dance, and they show up just to support the kids. They're not going there because it's to be entertained or like a professional experience. They're going there to support, and they're connected in their community. And that also comes with like the availability of resources. If the community is educated on, what resources are available, and then if people are working together, they feel empowered to share with each other. They ask for
Mhm.
that help. And that's something that, right now I feel like it's not taken as a sign of strength to ask for help anymore. And
Mhm.
really, I think that that's one of the biggest signs of strength that you can have is when you recognize that you do need that support. And so I'd love for you to kind of speak about how you help, foster parents build that community, and then how anyone else can kind of support, people, children in their areas that want to get more involved.
Yeah. Yeah, we talked about that team model early on, and the reason I push that so much is because of what you were talking about, Matt, that feeling of isolation that has happened. And it's even before technology, right? We started talking a lot about independence and looking out for ourselves. Really, I grew up in the 70s and 80s. I'm older than I look, and so I was young in the 70s and 80s, and I remember that big push towards, we all have to be independent. We all have to look out
Yeah,
for ourselves.
the bootstraps.
Yeah, oh yeah, don't even get me started on pulling ourselves up from the bootstraps, right? And we forgot that some people had access to that and other people didn't. Dan on the chat said he can't imagine going to 17 different homes. I'm an army brat. And I can't imagine living in that many homes. I moved my entire life, but it was structured. I had my family moving with me. I had a built in friend with my sister, so I had those things. And I very clearly tell people I was privileged. And I know I was privileged. But what I'm really trying to build is I want us to go back to that team model. I want us to go back to that idea of we are there to help each other. And so one of the things is not only do I train foster parents, but I have a community of foster parents that are part of a membership program that I run, as well as I teach a free foster care class every month. And I have a solid group of foster parents who attend every month because they need each other, right? They need that support. Isolation for foster parents, and I've also heard this for parents with children with disabilities, isolation for them is a very real thing. They don't know how to ask for help. Caregivers in general tend not to ask for help because that caregiving mind is like, I'm caring for everybody else.
Yeah.
No, I can't take care of myself. And so I have to work hard on teaching my foster parents about self-care, taking breaks in between taking placements. If a child leaves, giving yourself a month or two to grieve before you take another placement. And I know licensing agencies really want homes right away, but that's not good for the foster parent because they're going to burn out. So, we've got to think of those things. So when you talk about what can we do as a community, one of the things that I really like to push is there are a lot of churches out there that could be opening their doors for foster parents. And it doesn't have to just be churches. It could be any place of worship. Foster parents need safe places where they can meet with other foster parents, but they also need safe places where they can meet with the bio parents so that they're not in each other's homes and criticizing each other, that it's a neutral place. And we have these places of worship that have all the space that they use maybe on a Sunday or a Saturday and not necessarily the rest of the week. So I really think, that's one area where we really could be pushing our congregations. Are we opening our doors to foster kids? Are we seeking them out? Do you have a licensing agency that is in your area that is collecting things for foster families? Things like Christmas presents. Foster parents don't make money. I know that's another myth that goes out there. Foster parents don't make money. They barely get enough money to cover food for the kids. They don't get extra money if the kids are in childcare. They don't get extra money for any of those types of things. So they get maybe $50 a month for clothing, which today that doesn't buy a shoe,
No.
let
Yeah.
alone pair of shoes, right? You're not going to be able to buy one shoe with $50. So, and then that idea that kids move from home to home with trash bags, that's real. That's real. New York City just passed a law that every child in foster care is going to get a suitcase. But we could be doing that in our local communities. We could be calling up the licensing agency and saying, I have some older suitcases. Would you like them? I have clothes to donate. I had a kid here I'm in a suburb of Indianapolis. I had a kid who found me on Face or on Google. He Googled foster care and found me in his town. And he calls me up and he says, I have all this clothes that I just graduated from high school and I want to get rid of. Can I bring them to you? I was like, sure. I'm thinking, it would be a couple of bags. He brought me 10 bags of clothes because
Wow.
after I said yes, he went and got his sisters, he got his friends, he got all these people to put together all this clothes that they were not going to need when they went to college and brought it to me. I had a little Kia Soul and my thing was, it was packed full. So it's just knowing the need is out there and asking the questions. Call that licensing agency. What is it something I can do to help you guys? They need baby supplies, diapers, bottles, all of those types of things. So there's ways, but if we don't know the need, like you said, because these parts of our society are often hidden, we have to be proactive
Right.
and seek them out. And that's that young man. He went online to find a place to donate his clothes specifically for foster kids. And it
Yeah.
was just because he had a friend in high school who was a foster kid, and that's how he knew about it. So, those are the type of things that we can be doing as a society that makes a difference.
Absolutely. And I love that. Yeah, I got the chills when you said that what that young man did. And it's because of the experiences that he had, right, with someone who's connected to that.
Hmm.
And that's something that I feel like you don't need to have that firsthand experience to care about things, like that's like I've never had firsthand experience with homelessness, but
Right.
it's a really important issue to me because how we treat people who are at the lowest spectrum of income in our societies, that's how we're viewed as a society. And if we
Hmm.
can't take care of everyone here in the richest country in the world, like that's just crazy to me. And I think
Hmm.
it's in large part because a lot of people, they just avoid it. Like they don't think about it. Maybe it hasn't crossed their path.
Hmm.
But how do we kind of get that messaging out there to more people? And you mentioned like churches, so like providing other opportunities for people to give back, for people to make an impact in their community. Anything like that would be wonderful, I feel like, for the audience to know.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. There are just so many ways, but again, like I said, we have to kind of be proactive. And we have to remember that there are groups out there doing good work. It's just that we don't always hear about it. So, yeah, reaching out, finding those areas of need, finding something that you're passionate about. It doesn't have to be foster kids, right? It doesn't
Yeah.
have to be homelessness. There is a lot of need in our
Yeah.
society. But there's also a big need for compassion. And so the more we can shine the light and bring faces, because when we talk about foster kids up here, it's kind of like, oh, it's some nebulous group, but I know they exist. But if we bring those stories, those faces, so one of the things that I love to share are those foster kids who have taken it upon themselves to make a difference. So I have a large network on LinkedIn, and several of them are former foster kids who have went through the system, had bad experiences, and want nobody else to go through that again. They don't want them to have to experience what they experienced. And so they are making changes. They are working to build communities where there are foster voices out there. One of the craziest things that happens is our lawmakers make these decisions without ever talking to somebody that affects them.
Yep.
So when Biden was president, and I think it was like the year before his term ended or something like that, for the very first time, a sitting president brought in a group of school children to talk with the Federal Department of Ed about their experiences in school.
Wow.
Nobody had ever done that. Why? Right?
Yeah.
Who's bringing in the foster kids to talk to our lawmakers about fostering? Who's bringing in those from the homeless shelters to talk about why they're homeless?
Yeah.
Because let's be real, our politicians are not of us. I mean, we're getting further and further away from that. They're not people like us, and they don't have to live like us. I
Right.
see that on Facebook all the time, right? If politicians wouldn't be cutting all these programs if they had to live under them.
Right.
And yeah, I
100%.
mean, it's not an equal relationship right now, and so we have to bring those stories forward, and we have to put faces to them. We have to be telling them those stories. So I like to tell the story about my student who took full advantage of that collaborative care program and is doing well. I like to tell stories about these former foster kids that I have talked with who have made world changing moves in their lives in order to bring about change in our society. And I do a ton of podcasts because I want to get that face out there of and bring awareness to what kids in foster care experience in schools and homes, in society in general. And so we just have to keep bringing that voice, speaking for those who don't necessarily able to speak for themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that there has been, at least in the homelessness space, uh, more organizations that are doing a better job of having people with lived experience, be consulted on the solutions. And, I think where the homelessness and certain other nonprofits struggle is getting that message out to the broader community of people who just maybe haven't come across, this situation, people who are further
Mhm,
removed, maybe not quite to the level of the politicians, but they're not worrying
mhm,
about, some of the housing challenges. They're not worried about, some of the kids in their
mhm,
community. And so I think that that's really important work. And that ties us into, our last topic, which is, the role of advocacy in policy change.
mhm,
And, that's certainly in the homelessness space, a lot of the work that we do. And like I said earlier today, happened to be in a meeting with a local precinct, and that's what we were discussing, is how do you get the feedback from the people that are experiencing this so that you can provide better access to the support systems, because there
mhm.
are supports that exist, and to your point, like, they may not even be fully utilizing funds that are available
Yeah.
just because these people that need them don't know that they're there.
Mhm,
So I'd love to hear a little bit more about your advocacy efforts, and then for our audience, you've given a couple of different tactics of things that they can do in their community. But what
mhm,
would be some great steps that they could take if they wanted to advocate for, foster children, and then also for,
mhm,
the creation of better policies to enable them to be set up for future success?
mhm. So, because a big part of what I teach the foster parents is around actual laws, I try and stay up on those laws, right? Like, that is a big thing. I even, after I got started in this, and I came out of being a children's minister for 20 years and then decided I wanted to go back to my special ed roots and serve children with special needs or vulnerable children. That's how I got into the foster care world. Um, but when I started learning the laws and how important these were, I actually went and got a graduate certificate in education law just so I knew those laws and I stay up on top of them. So, one of the groups that I am connected to, that in fact I had a call with them today, I'm connected to the Child Welfare League of America, CWLA. And I'll tell you, the work that we do in that group is really powerful. We have weekly calls, and for many of us, those weekly calls are so important for our well being because we're doing this work together. A lot of times, like Matt said, we feel isolated, right? We're the only one on this hamster wheel trying to make change. But when I can come together with a group like CWLA, then I don't feel so alone. So we do a lot of things in that group in terms of sign-on letters for both the House and the Senate. We talk a lot about policies and what policies are under review, and how can we talk to this about those policies to politicians as well as community leaders. So I would suggest, if you do want to have some idea of what's happening behind the scenes legislatively for children in child care or in foster care, I would go to the CWLA.org website, and they have all sorts of action items that you can take, and they do a really good job of breaking down the laws in such a way that people who are not lawyers can understand it. Um, and I think that's just really important that we stay aware. One of the things, and again, I know I'm talking to the choir here because you guys are on this call. So obviously you care, you want to know. But one of the things that frustrates me is people have come to the point where they're like, well, I don't read the news. I don't pay attention to politics. I don't want to be upset. So I don't pay attention. And unfortunately, that's what's gotten us here today, is the fact that we didn't pay attention. And so it is our responsibility. We talk so much about our rights as Americans, but as Americans, we have the responsibility to be aware of what's happening in our country and what's happening to other Americans. And so we have to be staying on top of those things, getting connected to groups. You can follow bills on GovTracks. It's GOV Tracks, and you can sign up for whatever area that's of interest to you, and it'll give you a summary of what's happening in that area legislatively, as well as who do you contact, like who are on the committee heads and things like that that you can be writing to or contacting. Groups like that also give you talking points. So I would, hands up, would not feel comfortable just walking into a politician's office, right? Unless I had some talking points. And there are groups out there that are putting those things together for us. We just need to know that they're there. And finding ways to tap into that and adding our voice to the rest of everybody that's looking for changes.
Yeah, I love that you provided those resources, and particularly that you spoke about avoidance, as a mechanism. That I think that's something that when we go back to our earlier conversation about trauma, a lot of people just avoid things where they feel like they don't have any
Mhm.
control over. And
Mhm.
certainly in our current system, it does feel like there is a lack of things that you can do. And so I think that's what leads people down that path.
Yep.
And I do think in some instances it's set up intentionally so that the
Yep.
people in power can maintain that power and
Yep.
continue to have control and dictate the system so they can have the outcomes that are best for them and the people that they're concerned about, which
Mhm.
typically are people with an awful lot of money.
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
and not the people who, could just benefit from small things. And I
Mhm.
think that's, to your point, like that's our responsibility as
Mhm.
advocates in your community, because that could be you or I, that could be your neighbor. And so when you're educating yourself on the policies, you're not just looking at sensationalized headlines in the media, from people who are trying to get attention. Because
Mhm.
that's the other thing that we're often the product now in modern society, where our attention is what people are after, and people are trying to monetize on that attention. Um,
Mhm.
and so, being diligent, cutting through the noise, focusing on the policies, and really just exercising your rights, your freedom of
Mhm.
speech, your freedom to protest. These
Mhm.
things, can be challenged if we don't use them. And that I think is what we really need if we're going to affect large scale change, is for the silent majority to stand up. It's
Yep.
like the silent majority, if they can stand up and shout and we can figure out a way to come together, and going
Yep.
back to some of our earlier topics around community building, focus on the
Mhm.
similarities, focus on creating programs that are beneficial for all of us in society, then that
Mhm.
is really a great path forward towards, a society where we don't have children aging out of foster care and into homelessness, where we don't have almost a
Mhm.
million people that are currently living on the street or in shelters in this country. And if you look at how what societies have done that really well, like Finland, they invest in social systems.
Yes.
They provide that housing, they provide that support around the
Mhm.
housing. And so that's just what's so frustrating at times. It's like there are models that other
Yep.
countries with less resources than us are utilizing. And if we had the awareness, we could advocate for that policy change if enough people cared about it and didn't,
Yep.
just look the other direction.
Mhm. Well, and it is a lot about experience, right? We just, we just don't know how to live in somebody else's shoes. We
Yeah.
just don't know how to put ourselves in that place. And I know we've said it a couple of times, and it was in the chat a couple of times. Every single one of us is one step away from a disaster, right? I could be homeless tomorrow because I get struck down with an illness or an accident or something. My house could burn down. And then what happens after that? Do I have the backup to handle that? I do, but what somebody else might not. And so, again, going back to that blaming the victim, it's reminding ourselves we don't know why that person is where they are. We don't know what happened to cause them to become an alcoholic. We don't know. And so when we make those judgments and we don't are not able to put ourselves in their shoes, it's really hard to empathize. But I think that's what we have to do. We have to stop thinking about our experience and how come they couldn't just do what we did and start thinking about, is it really fair out there? Are the experiences the same? No.
Yeah.
I mean, Indianapolis, if you want a fresh meal where you can get like fresh veggies and fresh meat, you can't do that in our poorer neighborhoods because they don't have grocery stores.
Yeah.
They
Or
only have
food
gas
desert.
stations.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so of course these kids come into foster care and they've never had vegetables. And then the foster parents are like, why won't they eat vegetables? Well, they're addicted to salt, fat, and sugar. And it's because that's all that was available for them.
Yeah.
So instead of blaming the bio parents for misfeeding these kids, again, why are we not giving them access to good nutrition and things like that? So yeah, it's hard, but we need to be better about looking through somebody else's eyes, trying to imagine what those experiences would be.
Yeah, and even if for people that struggle with the empathetic side, like if you're looking at the self-interest of what's best for the community, it's investing in better outcomes for people like this, because that is what's going to lead to a safer community. Like crime is a symptom of poverty. It's
Yes.
often out of desperation, or people feel like this is the best thing that I can do to provide for myself right now.
Yeah.
Like that's what I view us as people, as we're imperfect creatures making the best decision we can with the information we have.
Hmm.
And because of their experiences and because of the environment they grew up in, that is why people walk down those paths oftentimes, because they feel it's the best opportunity. And there's
Hmm.
that lack of faith in the system, or lack
Yeah.
of faith in the community, because it just hasn't been built. And so I think that, I'm very excited to be partnered with you,
Yeah.
and for the opportunity to have this discussion, here
Hmm.
on this platform. So I'd love if there's anything that we haven't had the opportunity to address, anything specifically about how people can support you and your work, for you to share with the audience.
Sure. So, like I said, my main location to find me is LinkedIn. That's where I make most of my professional connections. I do have a group on Facebook, but that's more just foster parents and things like that. So, if you want to know more about what I am doing specifically, you can find me on LinkedIn under Sharon Dunlevy. It's and just you'll find me. I'm very active on there. So if you type in Sharon Dunlevy, it'll come up. You also can just go to my website, which is www Foster Care Training Today, which is the name of my company, fostercaretrainingtoday.com. I was telling Matt before we got into this, I just launched a crowdfunding. So I am trying to develop an app for my foster parents where they can get ongoing support via a mobile app. And it takes some money to do that. So I'm doing some crowdfunding to really try and develop this app where they can have a little bit more sense of connection and not being so isolated. So
That's amazing.
yeah.
And I love that work. And again, just kind of goes back into all of the topics that we discussed, and being able to provide that ease of access, help people build that community, and then go
Mhm.
out and advocate. And so I really appreciate you joining us, Sharon. This was a wonderful conversation. And
Me
again, if you
too.
want to support both Sharon and Cherry Willow, we have a collaborative T-shirt on our
Yeah.
site at cherrywillowapparel.com. If you look under the collab section, that provides funding for Sharon to continue her impactful work.
Mhm.
And it also provides our organization an opportunity to continue to do partnerships like this, and provide platforms for people who are making a difference in their community, to help get connected with new supporters. So thank you all so much for watching this evening's live stream. I hope that you learned something. I know I certainly did. And I look forward to seeing the impact that you're going to continue to make in your community, Sharon.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you all.